Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Smith. I'm a lawyer who challenged the government's use of certain criminal statutes in the January 6 cases. John Schlafly very eloquently referred to the government's use and abuse of some of these statutes earlier, but I'd like to ask you to imagine a scenario, if you will. Suppose protests break out all over the country relating to politics. Thousands of individuals go to the nearest national park. They flood the streets. Some of them engage in vandalism. There's some destruction of property, but the overwhelming majority of them do not destroy property. The overwhelming majority of them engage in nonviolent protest. But imagine that this is the federal government's reaction to the protests. Over 1,500 protesters are arrested, even those who didn't engage in violence. They're arrested from their homes in the middle of the night at gunpoint by FBI SWAT teams for misdemeanor offenses. That is, including offenses including trespass and other nonviolent crimes. Imagine that in response to these protests, the federal government got extremely creative with its use of very old statutes, including some of the Civil War statutes that John Schlafly was referring to earlier. And imagine the federal government said, well, even though obstruction of justice usually involves tampering with evidence or interfering with investigations, we're going to throw all of that out the window and prosecute nonviolent protesters for obstruction of justice for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine prosecutors throughout hundreds of years of court understandings of what obstruction of justice meant. Imagine that all of the judges who are presiding over these thousands of cases went along with that argument, which in ordinary times, law professors in the legal community would scoff at. Imagine in response to these protests, some individuals are charged with assault and face up to 20 years or more in prison for doing such things as touching signs that they're not supposed to touch and carrying signs over their heads that later crashed to the floor without any injury to police officers. Imagine the federal government was using the most intense sentencing enhancements in the book, such as a terrorism enhancement, to put the nonviolent protesters in prison for years or even decades. Imagine that the place where these protesters were prosecuted by the federal government was politically biased against them to the extent that 95% or more of the jury pool probably couldn't be impartial about presiding over their criminal cases. Imagine at the sentencing hearings of these defendants, the prosecutors encouraged judges to add time to the sentence for political statements that the protesters were making. Not statements that encourage other people to commit crimes, not racist statements. Just imagine that the prosecutors were highlighting the political leanings of the defendant in order to get higher sentences. Imagine that if in this scenario, the judges were calling the defendants traitors and treasonous and seditionists, even though those defendants had never been charged with those crimes. Imagine the judges were just assuming that was the case in court and punishing them accordingly. Imagine that evidence in a criminal trial in these cases included video clips of political debates between individuals running for the office of the presidency. That was evidence in a criminal trial. Imagine that world. So when we think about January 6th, it has political overtones. I think a lot of people don't really look at it from a criminal justice angle. They just think about it in terms of the politics. Are they for this politician or are they against him? And what gets lost is the objective facts of how these cases were prosecuted. It's almost not even considered at all. It's a secondary consideration. And I think it's essential when we talk about January 6th and its legacy to try to strip all of that political layer off the cases when we think about whether we want this to happen again. Do we want our prosecutors to be throwing nonviolent protesters in prison for things like trespass? Do we want prosecutors to be creatively interpreting statutes in ways that have never been done before in order to put nonviolent protesters in prison for decades? Do we want our judges to be referring to people as criminals for crimes they're not even charged with in court? And I think the obvious answer for any reasonable person is, of course, we don't want this to happen. So the question becomes, why did it happen? How could so many people in this system make mistakes like this? How could so many judges and prosecutors do things they don't normally do? Because what we saw on the January 6 prosecutions was a moral panic. There have been episodes like this in American history before. Another example is when parents of children in the Midwest were accused of acting like demons and abusing their children for years and years and years. And a conspiracy theory turned into a basis for investigating parents. It's now well known that this phenomenon of prosecutions that broke out in the 1980s was a moral panic, but we didn't really consider it that at the time. So to me, as someone who was deeply involved in these cases and bringing and challenging some of these statutes up to the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, the overwhelming lesson of January 6th is to keep politics out of criminal justice. It has to be removed. We can't have prosecutors deciding who to charge based on their political leanings. We can't have prosecutors looking through social media feeds of potential targets for investigations and deciding to charge based on the content of their speech, based on their political beliefs. And if you think that this is an exaggeration, that this is not what they did, you would be mistaken. It is all over the trial transcripts. Pull them, look at them. You will see prosecutors talking about speech of defendants over and over and over again. Sentencing hearings turned into struggle sessions, where if the defendants did not agree to eat their words, to go back on their support for a political candidate, the idea was the judge would punish them more. It's not American. It should never happen again. And we just have to try to think about this event and these prosecutions without the political overtones on top of them. That's my take home from January 6th.